What if the first hands to shape the cradle of civilization were not Sumerian at all, but belonged to a people whose name never survived long enough to be spoken? What if the story you've heard, that history begins in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, is only the faint afterglow of something far older, a memory so ancient that even the earliest clay tablets treated it as myth? There are moments when you trace the oldest layers beneath the Sumerian world that you feel the ground shift, as if the foundations of cities, languages, measurements, rituals, and gods were not created there, but inherited. And the deeper you look, the more you sense the outline of builders who left behind no skeletons, no graves, no epics of their own, only a silent architecture woven through the very birth of civilization. If you enjoy these quiet explorations into forgotten chapters of our world, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if it brings you a sense of calm. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time this story has found you tonight. The visuals in this documentary might add atmosphere, but you don't need to watch the screen to follow along. So go ahead and get comfortable. Dim the lights, settle into the pillow or the chair beneath you, and let the quiet of this moment carry you deeper into the mystery. Imagine you're standing at the edge of the Euphrates at dusk, long before modern borders carved these lands into nations. The river glows with the fading light, reflecting streaks of gold across the surface as the air cools just enough to let ancient scents drift out of the soil. Dust, river reeds, faint traces of clay baked in a sun harsher than ours. Just beyond the waterline lies a low rise, an unassuming mound of earth known in archaeology as a tell. Most travelers would walk past it without a second glance. But beneath this hill lies one of the quiet revolutions of early humanity, a place where archaeologists found something that did not match the Sumerian timeline at all. The site is called Tell Brak. On a map, it looks small, just a shape in northern Mesopotamia, close to the borders of modern Syria. But its oldest layers tell a different story, one hidden beneath millennia of rebuilding. When researchers dug down past the Sumerian levels, past the earlier city layers, down through the accumulated epochs of collapse and rebirth, they reached something unsettling. A settlement older than Uruk, older than Aridu, older than what we call the beginning. Right there in the dirt were architectural foundations far too large and too organized to belong to the villages expected at that time. Straight walls that shouldn't exist yet. Plaster floors that weren't supposed to appear for another 1,000 years. And scattered across the surface of these deep levels were hundreds of small, polished, obsidian eyes, tiny sculptures shaped like staring, unblinking guardians. Even now their gaze feels strangely deliberate, as if the people who made them were leaving something behind. Not a message, not a warning, but an imprint. A fingerprint of a culture that was already old when Sumer was young. The strangeness of Tell Brak doesn't come from dramatic ruins or impossible monoliths. It comes from the quiet precision of what shouldn't be there. Urban planning before urbanism, monumental spaces before writing, and a population density that the textbooks still struggle to explain. It is as if history slipped here, revealing a layer that the standard timeline had no place for. When archaeologists tried to fit Tell Brak into the accepted chronology, they found the pieces reluctant to settle. The earliest levels suggested a vast urban center dating back to nearly 6,200 years ago, centuries before Sumer's so-called first cities. And yet, these inhabitants were not Sumerian. Their pottery style was different. Their architectural proportions were different. Their obsidian trade routes were different. Even the ways they buried their dead seemed to belong to a different cultural logic. But the most puzzling element wasn't what was found, it was what wasn't. For such an advanced pre-urban community, the absence of written records is startling. No tablets, no proto-script, no seal impressions, no king lists, no myths. It is as though the people of Tell Brak built a vast city, lived their lives in structured order, raised monumental buildings, orchestrated long-distance trade, and then walked away without leaving a name for themselves. The silence of these earliest layers became the first doorway for researchers who sensed that Tell Brak might not be an isolated phenomenon. A few hundred miles to the southwest, beneath another mound, Tel Hamukar, archaeologists discovered destruction layers that predate Sumerian warfare, layers filled with evidence of organized projectile manufacturing. But once again, the people who built the earliest phases remained anonymous. Tools without owners, structures without identity, a sophistication without a civilization. If these had been scattered anomalies, they might have been dismissed as unusual outliers. But they weren't alone. Across the Mesopotamian floodplains, beneath the better-known strata of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon, a pattern began to emerge. Older foundations beneath the foundations. Not villages, not tents, but structured settlements built with intention and geometry, aligned with cardinal points, water channels, and foundations sunk into the earth with a type of engineering that implied either knowledge carried forward from somewhere older or knowledge passed down from someone else entirely. In one trench from a remote site near the Tigris, teams uncovered a section of wall made from stones that didn't originate in the region at all. The quarry was hundreds of miles away, and the stones had been shaped with a precision that seemed out of place for the era. Their faces were smooth, their edges aligned so cleanly that even now, a fingertip run along the surface feels a little strange. Too perfect, too deliberate, too intentional. It forces the mind to imagine hands practiced in a craft older than the site. Hands belonging to a people whose architectural knowledge did not seem to evolve there, but arrive. When you step back and consider these sites collectively, Tell Brak, Tel Hamukar, strange out-of-place stoneworks, pre-literate urban planning, the question grows heavier. Who were these early builders? Why did they vanish? And why does their presence appear only through the shadow they left on the world that followed? The air above Mesopotamia holds the answer in its soil layers, a kind of echo. Every civilization here seems to have inherited something without fully understanding it. Measurements in Sumerian texts match proportions used in earlier unmarked structures. Mythic cosmologies echo shapes found carved in pre-Sumerian layers. Even the earliest pantheons, the oldest gods of Sumer, arrive suddenly, as if remembered rather than invented, whispered into clay rather than dreamed. Yet the people who may have inspired these memories left behind no self-made story. No inscriptions saying, "We were here first." No sign of their origin. No sign of their end. Only their buildings, their alignments, their strange obsidian eyes, staring out of a city too old to belong where it stands. Tonight, as we begin this long journey into the forgotten architectures beneath civilization, you might feel a subtle unease. Not fear, but a recognition that the timeline we inherited may be only one layer of many. A layer resting atop another humanity that slipped through history without leaving a voice. Only a structure, a pattern, a presence. And perhaps, if we listen quietly enough, the silence of these ancient builders will begin to take shape in the shadows of everything that came after. The silence of those earliest foundations lingers in the mind long after you walk away from the archaeological reports. It lingers because it feels intentional, as though the emptiness itself is a message. And when you begin the slow descent into the deeper layers of Mesopotamia's ancient landscape, you find yourself guided not by the stories written on clay, but by the voids between them, voids shaped by a people who seemed to build with purpose, yet leave without explanation. To understand how strange this is, you have to return to another place where the soil speaks in contradictions. A site called Aridu, often celebrated as the first city, the birthplace of kingship, a sacred cradle of the Sumerian world. Yet if you strip away the religious gloss and the pride of later scribes, something about Aridu doesn't feel like a beginning. It feels like a continuation. When you stand before the layered rise of Aridu, with the hot wind sweeping across its stepped mound and the desert stretching beyond, it's easy to imagine that this was where civilization crystallized from the dust. But the earliest layers whisper a different tone. Instead of showing the gradual emergence of culture from simple huts to complex temples, as the conventional story demands, Aridu's earliest levels show something inverted. Advanced building techniques appearing before their supposed developmental stages. Floors plastered with a consistency that suggests practiced hands. Foundations aligned with geometric precision. Settlement patterns that feel more like an inheritance than an invention. As though the people who arrived already knew how to build sacred architecture and simply re-established what they had already understood elsewhere. The deeper you go, the more this pattern intensifies. Stratigraphic analysis reveals that the earliest inhabitants built with a confidence that implies a prior tradition. But where was that tradition born? Sumerian mythology answers with a mythic flourish. Aridu was created by the gods themselves. Yet this poetic explanation echoes a more haunting possibility, that the people who settled here were carrying the architectural memory of an earlier world, a world that had faded before clay tablets could immortalize it, a world built by those who had vanished. Archaeologists seldom enjoy confronting such implications because the orthodox framework depends on a clean developmental path. Simple to complex, scattered huts to organized cities, oral cultures to literacy. Yet Aridu refuses to play along. And it is not alone. Across the region, the earliest phases of multiple sites show similar leaps, jumps in organization, planning, and structural knowledge that seem too synchronized to be coincidences. It's as if a blueprint, older than history, was passed from place to place by a people whose identity evaporated between layers of silt. To make sense of these echoes, you must travel north once more, beyond Tell Brak's obsidian guardians, to a place where the past reveals itself through monumental stones half buried in the earth. Not in Mesopotamia, but in southeastern Anatolia, Gobekli Tepe, the site that has already shaken our understanding of humanity's capabilities during the Neolithic age. And yet, in the context of the pre-Sumerian enigma, Gobekli Tepe becomes more than an archaeological marvel. It becomes a signpost pointing toward an older master tradition of building, a tradition that might link distant sites across time. Standing at Gobekli Tepe's enclosure, you feel something ancient pressing through the silence. The T-shaped pillars rise from the earth like frozen sentinels. Their surfaces are carved with animals that seem to pulse with a kind of dreamlike memory. Nothing about this site behaves as expected for its age. These monuments appear suddenly, fully formed, with no obvious local developmental stages leading up to them, and like the earliest levels of Tell Brak, they were deliberately buried, not destroyed. Buried, as though sealed off by the very people who built them. If a forgotten culture possessed the knowledge to build monumental enclosures before agriculture, if they had the organizational skills, the geometry, the symbolic imagination, then perhaps Mesopotamia's early builders inherited more than we've realized. Perhaps what we see as the beginning is merely the nearest surviving ripple of something older and largely erased. Archaeologists often insist that Gobekli Tepe represents a local phenomenon, a singular exceptional site, a burst of creativity. But when you stand in the dust among its pillars, when you examine the clean geometry of their arrangement, you sense a deeper pattern, a pattern that resonates faintly with the pre-Sumerian strata buried beneath Mesopotamia's tells. Consider the measurements found in early Mesopotamian architecture, ratios, alignments, and ground plans that seem oddly familiar when compared to sites much farther away. Consider the repetition of circular or semicircular communal architecture across early Anatolia, northern Mesopotamia, and later Sumer. Consider the sudden appearance of standardized tools, weights, and building techniques across regions that supposedly had no direct connection. This isn't proof, it is resonance. But resonance has its own gravity. If you follow it long enough, you may begin to see the faint outline of a forgotten architectural tradition threading across thousands of years. Some researchers argue that the earliest Mesopotamian settlements simply evolved faster than expected. That population pressure, environmental changes, or the advantages of river agriculture accelerated urban development. And these explanations have merit. They offer structure, comfort, and a sense that we understand our own story. But in the quiet margins of field reports, you sometimes encounter sentences that betray uncertainty, findings that do not fit current models, layers that suggest earlier complexity, features that defy cultural attribution. The pushback often focuses on preserving the timeline, not out of malice, but because rewriting the earliest chapters is a monumental task. And if the truth lies thousands of years deeper than we want to admit, then the entire edifice of ancient chronology must shift with it. Yet the anomalies persist. In some sites, radiocarbon dates suggest organized building activity older than the orthodox Mesopotamian timeline allows. In others, artifacts appear suddenly without clear evolutionary context. Stone tools more refined than the layers above them, trade networks too vast for presumed village societies, pigments and carvings suggesting symbolic traditions far older than their supposed cultural origins. Each anomaly alone is an inconvenience. Together they form a quiet chorus calling toward something beneath the surface. To see how these pieces might connect, you must picture an ancient landscape not as a progression, but as a palimpsest, a manuscript written over again and again, each civilization overwriting the traces of the previous one, yet always leaving behind faint impressions. Beneath Sumer lies Ubaid. Beneath Ubaid lies Halaf. Beneath Halaf lie sprawls of settlements that have no names. And beneath those lie hints of something older still, a substrate of knowledge that appears suddenly, burns brightly, and fades without a clear lineage. One day, an archaeologist digging near the Diyala region described a strange sensation while brushing the dust off a series of aligned paving stones. They were older than the surrounding layers suggested they should be. Too perfect, too carefully arranged. She said it felt like she was touching the edge of a disappeared world. This phrase lingers because it captures something essential. The idea that the deepest roots of human culture might not be a gradual slope, but the remnants of a collapsed plateau. A higher starting point lost to catastrophe, time, and the floodplain's relentless recycling of memory. As you follow these buried traces across the map, a strange detail emerges. Many of the oldest sites share a peculiar quality. They were not abandoned gradually. They were emptied, often suddenly, often quietly, with no signs of fire or invasion, no mass graves, no destruction typical of war, as though the inhabitants simply walked away, as though their purpose had been fulfilled, or their world had reached a threshold beyond which they could not continue. This pattern, quiet abandonment, echoes across early Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and even parts of the Levant. It is a vanishing act, repeated with too much consistency to ignore. What sort of civilization leaves behind its buildings but not its bones? Its structures but not its name? Its influence but not its story? The more you examine the archaeological record, the more it begins to feel like a footprint of something we're not meant to see directly. Something that existed as a scaffold beneath later cultures, invisible yet foundational. A forgotten race of builders who shaped the earliest architecture not by accident or local experimentation, but by inherited memory, or by memory of a world before theirs. And then there are the myths, not the grand epics of kings or gods, but the deeper, quieter myths present in fragments across early Near Eastern cultures. Stories of a time when those who came before taught humanity how to build, how to measure, how to raise walls in harmony with the sky. Stories of cities founded not by the people living in them, but by figures described as ancient even by the earliest storytellers. These myths are often dismissed as symbolic, yet symbols often cling to truths the way fossils cling to stone. They preserve shapes even after life has left them. When fragments of these stories intersect with the physical anomalies beneath the Sumerian world, the mind begins to form a tentative hypothesis, not a conclusion, but a question shaped like a doorway. What if the pre-Sumerian builders were inheritors of a much older legacy, a civilization erased by a catastrophe so complete that only its architectural instincts survived? Or perhaps they were the final echoes of an even older lineage, migrating across the ancient world, leaving behind structures as quiet testaments to a knowledge soon to be forgotten. For now, all we have are layered clues, unfinished foundations, erased settlements, deliberate burials, anomalous craftsmanship, and myths that point toward a time before time. But as you follow these faint trails, you feel yourself drawing closer to the heart of the mystery, not yet touching it, but sensing the outline of something vast, something older than the oldest cities, waiting beneath the story we think begins in Sumer. Tonight, as you drift deeper into this labyrinth of forgotten layers, you may begin to feel that the past is not a straight line, but a series of echoes, each fading, each repeating, each pointing back toward an origin we have yet to remember. To move deeper into this forgotten world, you have to shift your gaze from single sites to the strange connective tissue between them, those faint trails of similarity that appear across regions separated by desert, mountains, and time itself. Patterns that shouldn't exist in cultures assumed to be isolated, patterns that whisper of shared memory rather than coincidence. And perhaps the most striking of these patterns emerges not from monumental stoneworks, but from something far more delicate: the way early settlements oriented themselves toward the sky. In the conventional model, archaic communities built haphazardly, reacting to rivers, terrain, and survival needs. But when archaeologists examined the oldest layers of multiple pre-Sumerian sites, from northern Mesopotamia to the Anatolian plains, an unsettling consistency emerged. The earliest structures, those lying deepest beneath later foundations, were aligned not randomly, but with a kind of celestial discipline. Some oriented their primary axes toward solstice sunrises. Others aligned their entrances toward specific stars that held significance in later Sumerian cosmology. But these alignments predate Sumer by centuries, sometimes millennia. How does a people with no writing, no cities, no recorded cosmology develop precision that would later define the world's first official civilization? The mainstream answer is cautious. Early humans observed the sky because their survival depended on it. Agriculture demanded celestial awareness. Seasonal shifts required careful attention. Yet this explanation fails to account for the level of precision found in certain early sites, where alignments deviate from true astronomical targets by only fractions of a degree, measurements difficult even with written records, let alone without them. And more curious still, some of these alignments match stars that would not have held agricultural value. Stars tied instead to mythic motifs, motifs that reappear later in Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian cosmology, as though inherited from a tradition predating all of them. One site in particular deepens the enigma: Nemric 9, tucked near the Tigris River. It is older than the earliest Sumerian settlements, and yet it possesses architectural features far more sophisticated than its age would suggest. Circular communal structures, carefully oriented entrances, stone pillars whose placement hints at astronomical observation, and a set of enigmatic carved heads with stylized, elongated features. Not quite human, not quite symbolic. When viewed alongside Tell Brak's obsidian eyes, the similarity in artistic instinct feels too deliberate to be the product of isolated development. As though both sets of artifacts emerged from a shared symbolic language, passed down by an older people, fading slowly across generations. But Nemric 9 holds another anomaly: the tools. Some are made from stone sourced from regions hundreds of miles away, transported across increasingly implausible distances for a culture that, according to mainstream chronology, should have been fully localized. The pattern is subtle but persistent. The earliest layers of settlement do not behave like locally evolving cultures. They behave like fragments of a migrating memory. Populations moving across landscapes not as nomadic foragers leaving random traces, but as carriers of knowledge, builders seeking places to re-establish something they once knew, something they once practiced, something they once embodied. Across these ancient plains, certain motifs reappear: spirals carved into stone, triangular patterns pressed into early clay, symbolic forms that later become hallmarks of Sumerian religious art. Yet their earliest appearances do not carry the flourish of invention. They appear, instead, as though already understood, as though their meaning had been inherited rather than discovered. And if these symbols came from a prior culture, one now vanished, then perhaps the roots of Mesopotamian cosmology were not created here, but transplanted. To explore this possibility, let your imagination travel down the length of the Tigris and Euphrates, through the marshlands where reeds sway in quiet waves, through the low hills where shepherds still walk the same paths as their ancestors, through lands that hold the layered memory of countless civilizations. In the realm of these ancient landscapes lies yet another anomaly: traces of an early, unexplained irrigation system buried beneath the known Sumerian networks. Channels that run too deep, too straight, too expertly engineered to belong to pre-urban farmers. Their construction suggests forethought, planning, and a relationship with water that predates the earliest known agricultural revolutions in the region. Mainstream explanations try to reconcile these anomalies with theories of cultural experimentation, local groups independently developing techniques ahead of their time, followed by diffusion into later civilizations. But there is a problem with this model. Diffusion takes time. Innovation spreads gradually. It leaves incremental traces. Yet the pre-Sumerian record shows abrupt appearances of advanced techniques, followed by equally abrupt disappearances. It is as if the knowledge arrived fully formed, was used for a time, and then dissipated without continuity. A discontinuity that feels impossible unless the knowledge was already ancient when it was first applied here. In some of these deepest layers, beneath the floors of later temples, archaeologists have found oddly shaped stone blocks whose angles suggest a geometry unfamiliar in early Mesopotamia, but reminiscent of techniques seen in distant regions. Primitive attempts at polygonal masonry, interlocking stone patterns, or precise shaping that seems out of place for the era. These are not Cyclopean walls by any means, not the titanic blocks of later enigmas, but faint echoes, faint enough to be ignored, yet persistent enough to raise eyebrows among those who study them closely. This kind of craftsmanship hints at a people who knew how to manipulate stone in ways their supposed contemporaries did not. A people with a relationship to form and structure that feels inherited rather than experimental. And then there is the matter of disappearance, not merely abandonment, but erasure. Entire phases of early settlement vanish without signs of conflict or catastrophe. Layers with structured, organized planning give way suddenly to periods of apparent simplicity, as though knowledge had receded instead of advancing. In some sites, tools become more primitive in upper layers rather than more advanced. Techniques degrade, styles simplify, trade networks shrink. This reverse progression is one of the most unsettling aspects of the pre-Sumerian mystery. Civilizations rise, but they do not normally fall back into pre-urban simplicity unless something cataclysmic disrupts their continuity. Yet here, no cataclysm is obvious. No evidence of war, plague, invasion, or fire defines the transition. It is a dissolution not of bodies, but of memory. To understand how strange this is, imagine walking into a modern city one morning only to find its inhabitants gone, not dead, not displaced by violence, simply vanished, and the next generation returning to rebuild without understanding the plumbing, the electricity, the architecture, or the underlying logic of the structures left behind. Imagine them repurposing foundations for simpler dwellings, not because they lacked intelligence, but because the knowledge that created the original structures had belonged to another people entirely, a people no longer present to explain their craft. This is the pattern emerging from pre-Sumerian strata. Not collapse, but replacement. Not evolution, but redaction. A world overwritten by new inhabitants who adapted what they found without comprehending its origin. A world where knowledge is not lost gradually, but abandoned abruptly, as though the bearers of that knowledge walked away or perished suddenly, leaving behind no teachers to guide those who would inherit their spaces. In this context, the absence of skeletal remains becomes more intriguing. Many early sites show surprisingly few burials for the populations they should have held. Some layers contain none at all. Others contain bones that do not match the expected populations of the structures above them. A few show signs of deliberate removal. Graves emptied, bones relocated, burial grounds erased. Why? Did the pre-Sumerian builders practice a mortuary tradition that left little archaeological trace? Did they cremate their dead? Did they bury them in separate locations now lost to time? Or did something more unusual happen? Something that prevented their remains from surviving into the eras that followed? Among the most enigmatic discoveries are elongated skull fragments found in isolated contexts across northern Mesopotamia and the Zagros foothills. These remains are rare and often controversial, not because of their shape. Cranial elongation was practiced by many cultures, but because of their age. Some appear to predate known examples of deliberate cranial modification, raising the uncomfortable possibility that the tradition itself may have been inherited from a group who practiced or embodied it long before Sumerian society existed. Yet the fragments are too few, too scattered, too incomplete to draw firm conclusions. They are whispers of a possibility, nothing more. But sometimes whispers carry truths that louder evidence obscures. The myths collected by later civilizations echo these whispers. In Sumerian lore, the first sages, the Apkallu, were described as beings of great knowledge who emerged before the flood, before writing, before kingship. They taught humanity architecture, measurement, agriculture, cosmology, and the arts of civilization. Some were described as part human, part divine. Others as beings who returned to the deep after their work was done. While mainstream interpretations treat these stories as symbolic, they align disturbingly well with the archaeological record of sudden appearance, sudden disappearance, and inherited knowledge without origin. Could these tales be distorted memories of a pre-Sumerian culture whose builders left behind structures and techniques that later generations mythologized? Or were the Apkallu themselves metaphors for the transmission of knowledge from a vanished people? The answer remains elusive, but the consistency with which these myths reference prior ages, ages of knowledge, ages of civilization, ages of instruction, suggests that ancient Mesopotamians themselves believed they were not the first. They believed they were inheritors. Even the earliest king lists begin with rulers who reigned before the flood, suggesting a world preceding the known world. A world erased by catastrophe, rewritten by the survivors, expanded upon by those who came later. But what if the flood legends scattered across the ancient Near East are less about water and more about memory? A metaphor for a reset. A veil drawn over a previous age whose details were lost, but whose influence persisted in stones, alignments, proportions, and the faint echo of a culture that shaped the foundations of later civilizations. If you listen closely to these layers of myth, architecture, migration, and anomaly, a tentative shape begins to form. A silhouette of people who mastered stone and sky, who built with intention, who possessed a symbolic language deep enough to survive across cultural boundaries, yet who vanished so completely that only their silent foundations remain. Tonight, as we continue our slow descent into the strata beneath Sumer, you may begin to sense the contours of that silhouette too. Not yet a face, not yet a name, but a presence, ancient, deliberate, and waiting patiently beneath the story humanity tells about itself. To trace the outline of this vanished people more clearly, you must step away from singular discoveries and immerse yourself in the quiet irregularities that accumulate across the earliest human-built landscapes. Irregularities so subtle that most archaeological narratives simply smooth them over. Yet, when you sit with them long enough, when you resist the urge to force them into the orthodox model, they begin to form constellations. And constellations, as the ancient builders themselves may have believed, are patterns that mean nothing up close, but everything from afar. One such constellation begins with an enigma embedded in clay tablets dating thousands of years after these forgotten builders lived. In certain Sumerian hymns, there are references to structures called ikur, a word often translated as mountain house, temple, or cosmic pillar. Scholars assume these are symbolic descriptions of later ziggurats, but the language used in the oldest hymns is curiously literal. It describes the ikur not as something newly built, but as something rediscovered, renovated, or re-established. Phrases like, "We rebuilt the house whose foundation was laid in distant days," and "We restored the plan that had been shown long ago," hint that the earliest Sumerians believed they were following a blueprint older than their own civilization. These texts become even more intriguing when compared with archaeological evidence. Many early Sumerian structures are built directly atop earlier foundations, not just on the same site, but using almost identical ground plans. Some temples exhibit construction phases that follow a mysterious architectural grammar, dimensions chosen according to ratios that do not match later Sumerian numerology, but do match ratios found in pre-Sumerian mud brick platforms and early Anatolian ritual enclosures. These ratios show up again and again, even when separated by geography and time. This repeated geometry forms a hidden thread running beneath the known civilizations of the ancient Near East. The dimensions reflect a kind of cosmic thinking, as though the builders believed certain proportions linked the sky and the earth. Later, Sumerian cosmology adopted this exact framework, but no one knows where they learned it. The earliest texts treat it as inherited knowledge. And when you look into the layers beneath those early Sumerian temples, you find something quietly astonishing. The proportions appear not to have been invented by Sumerians at all, but copied from foundations laid by a people whose name does not appear in any known inscription. Why would a culture adopt architectural ratios from a previous group? The mainstream answer is simple: continuity of site. People tend to rebuild in the same places. But while continuity explains location, it does not explain proportion. It does not explain the mathematical precision. It does not explain why foundations older than writing already display the structural logic of civilizations that would emerge centuries later. And it does not explain why these ratios match those found far to the north in early Anatolian ritual structures that predate Sumer by millennia. When you follow these ratios across the landscape, into the low hills of northern Iraq, the dry plains of Syria, the riverbanks of southeastern Turkey, they begin to feel like markers, like breadcrumbs left by a single tradition migrating across ages. A tradition no longer visible as a culture, but preserved in the way stones were laid, walls were measured, and buildings were oriented towards the heavens. Another breadcrumb emerges from the study of early figurines. Across pre-Sumerian settlements, archaeologists have found a recurring form: slender figures with elongated necks, large almond-shaped eyes, and smooth, abstracted features. They appear at Tell Brak, at Jarmo, at Nemrik IX, and even in remote highland sites in the Zagros. These figurines do not resemble the voluptuous fertility icons common in earlier Paleolithic and Neolithic traditions. They represent something different, a style that seems to echo a particular physical type or symbolic ideal, yet their meaning remains unclear. Were they depictions of revered ancestors, mythic beings, or possibly representations of the builders themselves? Mainstream interpretations lean toward symbolism. Yet the uniformity of these figurines over large distances suggests cultural coherence rather than independent artistic invention. It is as though scattered populations across the region all inherited the memory of a specific form, repeating it without fully understanding its origin. One archaeologist once described these figurines as having the expression of a people looking back at something lost. It is a poetic observation, but it captures an emotion embedded in their carved faces. An almost serene detachment, as though they are neither worshipped nor feared, but simply remembered. Even more curious are the architectural remnants found in the deep layers of the Iraqi site of Choga Bonut. These remains include early examples of what appear to be proto-courtyards, open central spaces surrounded by deliberately planned rooms. The layout seems to anticipate later Sumerian and Elamite building traditions, but the pre-Sumerian version shows no signs of development or experimentation. It appears fully formed in the archaeological record, as if drawn from a well-established architectural vocabulary. This is extremely unusual. Human architectural traditions normally display clear evolutionary paths, simple structures gradually becoming more complex. Yet here, complexity appears all at once, with no earlier prototypes. This sudden architectural maturity echoes the abrupt emergence of other early innovations, standardized weights appearing before standardized writing, precise pottery techniques emerging before evidence of large-scale specialization, and long-distance trade networks operating before the existence of urban administrative systems. Each phenomenon challenges the orthodox assumption that complexity must arise slowly. Instead, they behave as though inherited. At this point, it becomes useful to consider the geographic logic of these early cultures. Many of the pre-Sumerian sites are situated along what would later become critical nodes in Bronze Age trade and migration routes. Yet their placement seems to anticipate these later networks rather than react to them. As though their builders possessed a sophisticated understanding of landscape, climate, and resource distribution long before such knowledge should have existed. This again suggests that the builders did not randomly stumble upon advantageous locations. They selected them strategically, perhaps guided by a knowledge base that had survived from an earlier world. But how could such a knowledge base exist if no written records survived? One possibility is oral transmission. Another is embodied knowledge, skills passed from generation to generation, ingrained in craft traditions, architectural practices, and cosmological rituals. Yet the abrupt disappearance of this knowledge complicates the picture. Oral traditions fade slowly. Architectural instincts shift gradually. But the archaeological record shows sudden ruptures, moments when pre-Sumerian traditions vanish and are replaced by simpler, less refined methods that later generations build upon incorrectly. This strange regression is most evident in pottery traditions. Early Ubaid pottery displays crisp lines, fine geometric patterns, and symmetrical forms that seemingly arise from nowhere. But in deeper layers beneath Ubaid sites, there exist remnants of pottery with even finer craftsmanship, pieces that do not align with the developmental sequence expected by the textbooks. In some cases, the pottery becomes simpler as you ascend through time. This reverse evolution is extremely rare in the archaeological record, unless an outside disruption has severed the cultural transmission of skills. Such disruptions are usually connected to population replacement, new groups arriving, adopting some aspects of the older culture but failing to preserve the full complexity of its craft. Yet in the pre-Sumerian layers of the Near East, signs of violent invasion or mass migration are minimal. Instead, the pattern suggests a quieter kind of replacement, the slow disappearance of a culturally distinct group, leaving behind only the shells of their traditions. One hypothesis, rarely discussed publicly because of its speculative nature, is that the pre-Sumerian builders may have been a minority population within a larger region, a group with specialized knowledge that allowed them to shape early architecture, pottery, and ritual practices across multiple settlements. If this group declined in number or suffered a sudden demographic collapse, their traditions could have been partially adopted by surrounding peoples who lacked the full context to maintain or advance them. The result would be precisely what we see in the archaeological record: sophisticated early phases followed by simpler ones, with later cultures building upon an imperfect memory of the original techniques. If this hypothesis holds even partially true, it implies that the earliest civilizations of the Near East did not begin from a blank slate, but from the ruins of a prior cultural horizon. A horizon that, for unknown reasons, faded just as the world was transitioning toward greater complexity. This fading becomes even more intriguing when viewed alongside the near-synchronous emergence of early proto-writing systems across different regions. In the centuries leading up to the rise of Sumerian cuneiform, several symbolic traditions appear: decorative tokens, geometric seals, painted motifs on pottery, and numerical tallies. These systems share underlying principles despite their geographic separation. The mainstream view is that symbolic communication emerges naturally as societies grow more complex. But the suddenness of these simultaneous developments suggests something else: the scattered memory of a lost way of recording knowledge, one that may have been more advanced but was no longer fully understood. Imagine a group of people inheriting fragments of an older script without the ability to reproduce it completely. They might imitate the shapes, reinterpret them, simplify them, repurpose them. The result would be the proto-writing systems we see in the archaeological record, shadows of something older, crystallizing into new forms because the original was already slipping away. Mythology supports this possibility. Early Sumerian texts describe the me, divine decrees or conceptual building blocks of civilization, descending from the heavens, carried by beings of great wisdom. Some scholars interpret the me as metaphors for cultural innovations, pottery, writing, kingship, architecture. But what if these myths reflect a distorted memory of receiving knowledge from a prior culture? A culture so old that later generations mythologized it as divine. Many early civilizations attribute their founding to gods not out of ignorance, but because the memories they inherited were too ancient, too fragmented, too mysterious to be attributed to ordinary ancestors. As you sit with these layers of myth and anomaly, a subtle unease begins to form. Not fear, but the sensation that our history may rest upon the ruins of another history, a history that ended abruptly, leaving behind craftsmen without names, architects without identities, astronomers without written theories, and a symbolic language that survived only in fragments scattered across the ancient world. To feel the weight of this possibility fully, imagine kneeling beside a pre-Sumerian wall, your hand brushing against bricks shaped by someone who lived in a world with no written memory. The bricks feel warm from the sun, their edges still firm after thousands of years. You look at the precision with which they were laid, and realize that whoever built this structure possessed knowledge far beyond what their era should have allowed. And yet they left no trace of their thoughts, their beliefs, their origins, only the silence of their work. This silence is not emptiness, it is density. It is a weight pressing against the edges of what we think we know. It suggests that the story of the ancient Near East is not a tale of invention, but of inheritance. Not a natural rise from simplicity to complexity, but a recovery, partial, fragmented, imperfect, of knowledge left behind by a civilization that had already reached a higher plateau before slipping into the shadows of prehistory. And so the question deepens. If such a civilization existed, who were they? Why did they vanish? And why does their legacy linger only in the faintest of echoes, ratios, alignments, figurines, pottery lines, forgotten foundations, rather than in stories or skeletal remains? The answers remain hidden for now, but as you continue descending through these layers of forgotten architecture and inherited memory, you cannot help but feel that you are approaching the threshold of something vast, a presence that has waited beneath the world's oldest cities, patient and silent, for thousands of years. Tonight, as the ancient builders grow sharper in outline but remain elusive in identity, the path ahead invites you deeper still. Through shifting layers of earth and myth, through vanished settlements and inexplicable precision, through the faint geometry of a world that existed before civilization remembered its own name. As the outline of this forgotten people sharpens, you begin to sense that the clues left behind are not random artifacts, but pieces of a pattern, an inheritance scattered across the earliest human-built landscapes. To follow that pattern, you have to shift from architecture to something even more intimate, the way early humans moved across the land itself. When archaeologists map the locations of pre-Sumerian settlements, a strange distribution emerges. Some lie along riverbanks, as expected, but others appear in places that make little environmental sense. Arid uplands, escarpments without easy access to water, elevated terraces overlooking plains where later communities would never settle. These sites are older than Sumer, older than Ubaid, older even than the widespread Neolithic towns of the Fertile Crescent. Yet they show signs of long-term occupation and planning, suggesting that the people who built them were not merely following water or resources. They were following something else. One theory proposes that these settlements align with ancient trade routes, but trade, as understood in the traditional model, should not be this advanced at such an early stage. Moreover, the goods found at these sites, obsidian, finely made stone tools, pigments, suggest a network that operated with surprising coherence. Long-distance exchange requires shared language or symbolic systems, trust between groups, and a complex understanding of territory. All of this implies a level of organization inconsistent with the supposed simplicity of these early societies. Unless, of course, the organization was not new. Unless it was inherited. A more unconventional idea suggests that these settlements were aligned not to the rivers, but to the sky, to certain celestial objects that held significance across millennia. When researchers compared settlement orientations with the positions of prominent stars such as Sirius, Aldebaran, and Vega at different prehistoric epochs, faint correlations appeared. These correlations are not definitive, they are suggestive. But suggestion is precisely what accumulates in the pre-Sumerian mystery: hints, echoes, half-erased intentions. If these earliest builders oriented their settlements to the heavens, they did so in a manner later Sumerians would adopt explicitly, aligning temples to the rising of sacred stars, measuring kingship in reference to cosmic cycles, binding architecture to astronomy. But again, the earliest layers show the knowledge appearing suddenly, already mature. And these celestial traditions appear not only in Mesopotamia, but in early Anatolia, the Levant, and regions even farther afield. As if a dispersed group once shared the same sky-oriented worldview, one coherent enough to imprint itself across vast distances. This suggests something unexpected, a shared cosmology before the rise of shared writing, a worldview powerful enough that scattered descendants or inheritors repeated it across generations without fully understanding its origin. A growing number of researchers have quietly pointed out another anomaly. Pre-Sumerian sites often exhibit strange uniformities in their earliest phases that deteriorate over time. Floor plans begin consistent, but become inconsistent as centuries pass. Boundary walls start as straight lines, then become crooked. Pottery begins refined, then becomes rougher. This reverse development is profoundly unusual unless a skilled population has declined, disappeared, or been replaced by newcomers who lacked the expertise to maintain the original standards. This leads to one of the most unsettling possibilities. The pre-Sumerian builders were a distinct population, smaller in number, more technically capable, and perhaps carrying a cultural memory far older than any site we have excavated. Their disappearance would explain the abrupt decline in quality. Their absence would create the gaps in transmission. Their fading would leave behind only the shells of their traditions. But who were they? Were they simply an early branch of Homo sapiens with unusual skills? A culturally unique group that developed knowledge earlier than its neighbors? Or a population whose origins lie even deeper in time, perhaps connected to older horizons of human migration, now obscured by climate shifts, geological changes, and the relentless recycling of ancient landscapes. To approach this question from another angle, consider the earliest signs of what researchers call megalithic thinking. Megaliths, large stone constructions, are usually associated with much later cultures. The builders of Gobekli Tepe, the Neolithic architects of Malta, the mysterious engineers of early Anatolia and the Balkans, and later stone cultures in Europe and Asia. But in some pre-Sumerian layers, archaeologists have found proto-megalithic practices. Stones positioned deliberately, smaller than true megaliths, but shaped or placed in ways that suggest ritual or symbolic intention. These stones sometimes appear in pairs or circles, echoing patterns found thousands of years later across distant lands. The mainstream view interprets these motifs as cultural coincidence or parallel evolution, a natural result of human symbolic expression. But the patterns feel too deliberate, too consistent, too ancient to dismiss so easily. If a proto-megalithic intuition existed in the pre-Sumerian world, then perhaps the knowledge that blossomed into monumental stonework at Gobekli Tepe and other early sites was part of a much older tradition, one fractured by time, scattered by climate events, or fractured by migrations. This brings us to the climate question. Around 6200 BC, the planet underwent a significant climatic disruption known as the 6200-year event. Global temperatures dropped suddenly. Droughts spread across regions critical to early farming. Entire ecosystems shifted within a few generations. This event coincides eerily with the transitional phases of multiple early Near Eastern cultures. It also coincides with the quiet disappearance of certain settlement patterns and crafts in the deepest layers. While not a singular catastrophe, this climatic shift could have accelerated the collapse of an older population, especially one dependent on specific resources, trade routes, or symbolic landscapes. If the pre-Sumerian builders were already a minority or a culturally distinct group, such a climate shock might have fragmented them beyond recovery. Their traditions might have been diluted into surrounding populations, leaving behind material traces without continuity. In other words, their knowledge did not vanish because it was forgotten in the usual way. It vanished because the people who carried it dissolved into the larger human story. And yet, certain details refuse to fade completely. Some of the oldest human-made pigments found in pre-Sumerian contexts match compositions used in later cultures for ritual and symbolic purposes. Carvings depicting abstract symbols, spirals, crosses, concentric circles, appear in early contexts long before they become common motifs in Sumerian and Near Eastern art. Even the earliest seals, used for marking goods or identifying individuals, show patterns that resemble much older artistic languages, as though the idea of symbolic representation had roots that archaeology has not yet uncovered. These parallels lead some researchers to propose a more radical possibility, that the pre-Sumerian builders were not simply early agriculturalists or isolated advanced groups, but the inheritors of a cultural memory extending into what archaeologists call the Dark Zone, the period before 10,000 BC. This era, stretching back into the late Pleistocene, is poorly understood due to rising sea levels, shifting river systems, and the scarcity of preserved sites. Yet scattered evidence suggests the existence of advanced symbolic traditions, complex toolmaking, and knowledge of the stars. If the pre-Sumerian builders were descendants of a culture that survived the end of the last ice age, their sudden appearance in the archaeological record would make far more sense. Their knowledge would have been ancient, their skills already refined, their cosmology deeply rooted in an older worldview tied to a sky that looked slightly different due to precession. This could explain the celestial alignments, the architectural ratios, the symbolic motifs, and the unexpected sophistication. It would also explain why the earliest layers appear as though knowledge has arrived fully formed. For it had not been invented. It had been preserved. Mainstream archaeology resists such interpretations for understandable reasons. The deeper we push the origins of civilization, the more difficult it becomes to anchor them in material evidence. Without extensive sites from before 10,000 BC, researchers hesitate to propose scenarios that risk collapsing the conventional model. The academic caution is not malicious, it is practical. But the weight of anomalies continues to grow, and each anomaly widens a crack in the linear narrative of human progress. If you follow those cracks far enough, you eventually encounter a possibility both humbling and unsettling. Humanity may be a species with amnesia. Not metaphorical amnesia, but literal, forgetting entire epochs, entire cultures, entire experiments in living, erased by climate change, migration, catastrophe, or slow dissolution. The pre-Sumerian builders may have been the last guardians of a memory stretching into a world we no longer recognize. And then there are the bones, or rather, the lack of them. This remains one of the most haunting aspects of the mystery. In many early sites, the population density implied by the structures should have produced thousands of burials. Yet only a handful are found, often in contexts that do not align with the settlement phases. Some remains appear intrusive, buried centuries later in abandoned structures. Others show signs of being relocated. The missing dead cast a heavy shadow over the narrative. Where did they go? Were they buried elsewhere? Did they practice mortuary rituals that left no trace? Or did something else happen? Something that altered the biological legacy of this population before it could be preserved archaeologically? Some speculative researchers propose that the pre-Sumerian builders were a transient elite, a mobile crafting class, a priestly group, or a migrating order of architects who moved between settlements, shaping them according to a shared cosmic template. Their numbers might have been small, their genetic footprint diluted rapidly into larger populations, leaving behind only cultural echoes. This could explain the rapid disappearance of their distinctive features. Yet it does not fully account for their unusual skill or the coherence of their symbolic traditions. Other interpretations push further into the unknown, that the builders may have belonged to a lineage with a unique physical or cultural identity now obscured by millennia of mixing. But without skeletons, without clear genetic evidence, such ideas remain the domain of speculation. Not dismissed, but suspended in the realm of unanswered questions. Even so, the absence of remains forces the mind to consider possibilities that lie outside the comfortable boundaries of conventional history. And the ancient Mesopotamians themselves seemed to recognize this gap. They spoke of beings who existed before them, who possessed knowledge beyond human reach, who returned to the deep or ascended to the heavens after fulfilling their roles. Whether symbolic or literal, these myths resonate with the archaeological silence. They suggest an inherited recollection of a world structured by others. others whose presence lingers in the logic of stones, ratios, and alignments. As you drift deeper into this forgotten architectural labyrinth, you begin to sense that the mystery of the pre-Sumerian builders is not merely a puzzle of lost people. It is a threshold, a doorway into a chapter of human history that remains soft, blurred, unfinished, waiting for someone patient enough to read the faint lines left behind. And tonight, as these faint lines converge into the outline of a forgotten race, you feel the story thickening. The air grows heavier, the silence grows deeper, the presence grows nearer. Something is taking shape in the shadows beneath the world's first cities, something that has waited a very long time to be remembered. To follow the faint trail left by this forgotten people any further, you must venture into the deep frontier between what archaeology can excavate and what ancient memory quietly preserves. It is here, in this twilight space between soil and story, that the outlines of the pre-Sumerian builders shift from scattered anomalies into something resembling a coherent presence. Still ambiguous, still shrouded in silence, but unmistakably real in the imprint they left upon the world. And perhaps the most revealing aspect of that imprint is not the structures themselves, but the logic behind them, the quiet, deliberate principles that guided their hands. Among the earliest indications of this hidden logic is a peculiar numerical pattern that emerges from measurements across several pre-Sumerian sites. In many early foundations, the lengths of walls, room proportions, and even the dimensions of ritual platforms frequently fall into ratios that approximate whole number harmonics, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3 power, 1, 2. These ratios reappear across regions without evidence of direct cultural contact, suggesting something deeper than local experimentation. Scholars typically explain such consistency as practical. Builders use what works, what aligns with available materials. But the persistence of these exact ratios across unrelated sites hints at a shared architectural grammar, a conceptual template shaping the earliest human attempts at monumentality. Later civilizations, Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, would adopt mathematical systems, sacred geometries, and cosmological proportions that echo these early ratios. Yet none of them claim to have invented them. In their own texts, the knowledge simply was. This framing becomes more intriguing when paired with the earliest myths about the origins of measurement and architecture. In several Sumerian hymns, measurement is not described as a human invention, but as a gift received from beings who existed before the flood, before kingship, before the black-headed people. These beings are described as wise ones, builders of the foundation, keepers of the plans, those who measured the sky. Such phrases might be poetic metaphor, but they also reflect a deeper intuition shared by early Mesopotamians, that the knowledge of measuring land, aligning structures, dividing spaces, and orienting walls according to celestial cycles was not created by them. It was inherited. Yet they could no longer remember the original teachers, only the echo of their presence. To explore this echo further, imagine for a moment one of the earliest settlements at the northern edge of Mesopotamia, a rectangular platform of packed mud brick, its corners aligned to the cardinal directions, its central courtyard open to the sky. Around the platform stand smaller structures arranged with an almost mathematical consistency. The sun rises at a specific angle, illuminating the courtyard for a brief period before disappearing behind the platform's edge. Archaeologists would later find that this alignment matches the sunrise on a solstice, not of the settlement's era, but of a much earlier epoch, one belonging to the late Pleistocene, thousands of years before these people lived. How could the builders have known this? The simplest explanation is that they did not. They were maintaining a tradition whose original astronomical knowledge had already begun to drift due to precession, the slow shift of the Earth's rotational axis over millennia. This is one of the most revealing signs of inherited knowledge. When a civilization preserves a tradition even after its original purpose has become misaligned with the sky. In some early sites, the alignments are off by just the amount expected if the original template came from a far older epoch, as though the builders were repeating instructions they no longer fully understood. This implies a chain of transmission spanning thousands of years, far longer than most oral traditions survive intact. Yet it may not have been oral tradition alone. It may have been encoded in the very act of building. When a culture passes down rituals through architecture, through the orientation of doors, the shape of rooms, the alignment of platforms, they create a resilient container for knowledge, one less vulnerable to forgetting. If the pre-Sumerian builders belonged to a lineage that survived the end of the Ice Age, carrying only fragments of a once greater cosmology, then their structures might preserve that cosmology more faithfully than their words. Fragments of this greater world-view surface again in the peculiar artifacts found in early settlements, discs carved with radial lines, stones etched with constellations, small plaques adorned with abstract geometries. These pieces are often classified as decorations or charms. But when examined through the lens of archaeoastronomy, many appear to encode cycles of the moon, positions of stars, or even seasonal markers. Some pre-Sumerian clay discs found near the Kabur River show radial scoring that may represent lunar phases. Others depict patterns resembling the positions of major stars at sunrise over ancient horizons. Taken individually, they are curiosities. Taken together, they form a symbolic grammar, a vocabulary of cosmos-shaped thought stretching back into prehistory. Curiously, this grammar persists into early Uruk culture, but the Uruk scribes treat it as sacred knowledge inherited from the deep past rather than created in their own time. In one of the earliest temple inscriptions, a priest writes that the temple plan he follows was revealed in the days before the black earth was raised, an evocative phrase interpreted by scholars as a poetic reference to primeval times. Yet the specificity of the architectural details described in this inscription echoes much older building traditions, traditions that the inscription suggests were rediscovered, not invented. At this point, the mainstream model begins to strain. Its foundational assumption that complexity emerged independently in multiple regions due to agriculture and population growth cannot easily accommodate a scenario in which cosmic knowledge, architectural precision, symbolic continuity, and long-distance cultural coherence predate the earliest cities by millennia. And so mainstream interpretations typically lean toward coincidence or parallel evolution. Yet this approach often downplays the uncanny precision and consistency found in the earliest strata. Consider the phenomenon of early standardization. In the earliest layers of several pre-Sumerian sites, archaeologists have discovered clay tokens, small geometric shapes used to record quantities or transactions. These tokens represent one of the earliest known information systems. The mainstream interpretation argues that such tokens developed organically as communities grew more complex. But certain early tokens show standardization across regions separated by hundreds of miles. Their shapes and quantities match in ways suggesting a shared system, not independent invention. Yet this system appears fully formed, with no gradual developmental stages. When confronted with such anomalies, some scholars quietly offer an alternative. Perhaps the region was once home to a cultural horizon now lost to time, a horizon that transmitted symbolic and architectural traditions across vast distances long before the rise of writing. If this horizon had been disrupted by climate, by migration, by catastrophe, its people might have left behind fragments but no clear record of their identity. Their knowledge might have survived only in the practices of those who came after, distorted over time into myth. Another anomaly emerges from geology. Certain pre-Sumerian builders seem to have understood the properties of soil in ways difficult to reconcile with their presumed technological level. Foundations were often placed on stabilized sublayers, using gravel or compacted clay to prevent subsidence. In some regions, builders dug drainage channels beneath major structures, techniques that would not become common again until much later. Such engineering knowledge suggests a deep understanding of landscape and hydrology, knowledge that later Sumerians inherited but did not claim to originate. The most compelling evidence for a vanished architectural intelligence comes from pre-Sumerian stone-cutting traces found in the Zagros foothills. In one isolated site, archaeologists discovered a cluster of stone blocks with parallel grooves carved into their sides. These grooves resemble the marks left by stone sawing techniques known from much later cultures. But these blocks date to a period when stone sawing was supposedly unknown. They lie abandoned, half-finished, as if the builders stopped abruptly, leaving behind an experiment, or perhaps a relic, of a technique that vanished with them. The tools that created these grooves have not been found. This phenomenon, advanced techniques appearing briefly, then disappearing, occurs repeatedly in the pre-Sumerian record. In pottery, in architecture, in symbolic representation, in lithics. It is as if the early builders possessed knowledge that their successors could not replicate, not because they lacked intelligence, but because the knowledge did not originate with them. It arrived, was used for a time, and then dissolved without continuity. As the pattern sharpens, you begin to sense the contours of a cultural presence that operated like an undercurrent beneath early civilization, shaping it, guiding it, leaving behind subtle signatures but no names. This presence did not behave like a large, centralized culture. It behaved like a network, a tradition carried by small groups moving between settlements, a lineage of specialists, architects, astronomers, ritualists, whose expertise allowed them to shape the earliest built landscapes while leaving behind few traces of their own identities. This idea finds faint support in an unusual detail noted in several excavation reports. The earliest levels of certain sites show a higher degree of standardization than later levels. At first, this seems counterintuitive. You expect cultures to become more standardized as they grow. Yet here, the opposite occurs. The earliest phases show coordination, alignment, and uniformity across great distances. Later phases fragment, diversify, become localized. This reverse pattern suggests that the earlier culture may have been unified by a common identity or shared tradition that later dissolved into regional diversity. The most enigmatic piece of this puzzle comes from linguistic studies, not of written languages, but of substrate words. Substrate words are terms in a language that do not originate from the language family itself. They are inherited from an earlier, unknown language spoken by the previous inhabitants of a region. In Sumerian, dozens of such substrate words exist, terms related to agriculture, architecture, ritual, water management, and cosmology. These are precisely the domains in which the pre-Sumerian builders seem to have excelled, yet their language is lost. Their words survive only as isolated relics within Sumerian vocabulary. Substrate analysis suggests that the people who transmitted these words were not Sumerians, not Ubaidians, and not any known group of the region. They were older. Their language vanished, their identity dissolved, their knowledge dispersed into later cultures. The substrate evidence implies not a small local community, but a widespread population. Widespread enough to leave linguistic fingerprints across a large region, yet culturally invisible in later records. What kind of people leave behind their knowledge, but not their names? Their architecture, but not their stories? Their influence, but not their bones? As you study these clues, a picture begins to form. Not a complete image, but a silhouette. A silhouette of a people who straddled the end of the Ice Age and the dawn of civilization. People who carried fragments of a cosmology older than the sky they inherited. People who rebuilt sacred ratios, realigned ancient templates, preserved symbolic traditions, and passed on techniques that would later form the foundation of Sumerian greatness. Yet these people were fading even as history began. Their memory was already dissolving when the first clay tablets were pressed. Their words were already becoming substrate. Their knowledge was already being mythologized. And by the time Sumerian scribes wrote about the first builders, the real builders, the ones who came before, had already become shadows. Tonight, as you follow these shadows deeper into the archaeology of silence, you begin to feel that the vanished people are not simply a historical puzzle. They are a presence woven through the very fabric of the world we inherited. A presence that left behind no monuments of identity, only monuments of intention. And in those intentions, ratios, alignments, symbols, traditions, you sense the heartbeat of a world older than Sumer, older than the flood, older than memory. The next step lies not in the ground beneath our feet, but in the fragile boundary between myth and evidence. A boundary that the pre-Sumerian builders seem to occupy with uncanny ease, as though their story was never meant to be found in one place, but pieced together like a mosaic scattered across the ages. To move deeper into this twilight region between evidence and myth, you must expand your view beyond the boundaries of Mesopotamia itself. The more you examine how early peoples across the ancient Near East began their architectural, symbolic, and cosmological practices, the more you start to sense an unsettling coherence, one that doesn't behave like regional invention or parallel evolution or isolated cultural experimentation. It behaves like residue, like the fading fingerprints of a civilization that once spanned a broader landscape, dissolving long before writing could tether its memory to clay. One of the most revealing traces of this broader pattern appears in the Zagros foothills, among a series of enigmatic early settlements clustered along ancient river terraces. At first glance, these sites seem simple: early farming communities, storerooms, hearths, stone tools. But beneath the surface, Literally and figuratively, something stranger emerges. Several sites reveal subterranean chambers, not deep caves, but intentionally dug spaces with reinforced walls, smooth plastered surfaces, and a peculiar acoustic quality. Sounds echo strangely within them, as though the chambers were designed to amplify certain frequencies. Mainstream archaeologists typically interpret these underground rooms as storage spaces. Yet many are inexplicably clean of grains, tools, or artifacts. They contain nothing. Their walls are too carefully shaped for mundane utility, and above them, early structures appear aligned in ways that echo the cosmic orientations of other pre-Sumerian sites farther west and south. These sites seem small and humble, yet they hint at a tradition of sacred or symbolic architecture that predates the monumental stone circles of Gobekli Tepe and echoes faintly into the earliest temples of Sumer. Across the landscape, similar anomalies emerge in clusters, like whispers repeating across different regions. Consider the early site of Tepe Gaura, not far from Mosul. Its deepest layers reveal structures arranged with an odd geometric order, including circular buildings whose precise curvature suggests a conceptual mastery of form. Some rooms contain central pillars, reminiscent of early Anatolian sites. Certain symbolic marks carved into clay vessels appear startlingly similar to motifs found hundreds of kilometers away in early Iranian settlements. And in the center of one early level, archaeologists discovered a foundation whose proportions match those used thousands of years later in Sumerian temples, suggesting that the sacred geometry of later civilizations was not entirely their creation. As you trace these echoes across the map, another layer begins to emerge: the peculiar resonance between early Mesopotamian myths and geological realities. Sumerian texts describe a time when the boundaries between land and water were unstable, shifting with sudden violence. They speak of the lower world rising, of floods not as singular catastrophes, but as cycles. They speak of sages who lived through ages lost to memory. Geological studies confirm that the end of the last ice age produced rapid sea level rise, massive flooding in river valleys, and sudden shifts in the Tigris-Euphrates basin. It is not far-fetched to imagine that remnants of early cultures with coastal settlements or riverine networks were displaced, scattered, or erased during these upheavals. If the pre-Sumerian builders were among those survivors, carrying the remnants of a cosmology forged in a different world, then their presence in Mesopotamia would have appeared sudden, advanced, and mysterious. Their architectural instincts, symbolic vocabulary, and cosmological knowledge could have been fragments of a tradition older than agriculture itself. Their disappearance might then reflect not a slow decline, but the final fading of an Ice Age lineage overwhelmed by new environmental conditions and expanding populations. This possibility grows stronger when you consider yet another anomaly: the earliest forms of irrigation in Mesopotamia. In some cases, irrigation channels appear in layers too old to be attributed to large, organized societies. These channels follow principles of gradient control, water dispersion, and sediment management that require experience, not experimentation. Later, Sumerians treat irrigation as one of the gifts of the gods, yet they also describe inheriting canals whose makers are not known. The earliest waterworks appear not as experimental attempts, but as refined systems, too refined for communities allegedly transitioning from nomadic life. This suggests a strange inversion. Instead of agriculture leading to settlement, settlement may have been re-established in places where an older population already understood how to shape water. A forgotten group with agricultural knowledge older than the Neolithic revolution, knowledge carried across regions, preserved imperfectly, then imitated by later cultures who turned it into myth. But perhaps the most haunting clue lies in the continuity of symbolic imagery between pre-Sumerian sites and early Sumerian mythic figures. Among the earliest cylinder seals, there appear stylized figures with elongated heads, large almond eyes, and narrow faces, images thought to represent deities or supernatural beings. Yet these motifs echo the physical forms of pre-Sumerian figurines found hundreds of kilometers away. Why would later Sumerians depict their earliest gods with the same elongated features as figurines carved by a people who vanished long before Sumer emerged? Mainstream interpretations insist that these similarities are symbolic. Yet symbolism often originates from memory. And when memory is stretched across thousands of years, the line between literal and symbolic begins to blur. It is possible, just possible, that the earliest Sumerians mythologized real individuals or real groups whose physical appearance differed subtly from their own. Or perhaps the traits symbolized a role, a function, a lineage of knowledge-bearers. To explore this idea further, imagine a small group of pre-Sumerian builders moving across the landscape at the end of the Ice Age. Architects, astronomers, and craftspeople carrying a tradition inherited from ancestors who lived in a very different world. Their population may have been small, perhaps diminishing with each generation. But their knowledge was deep, refined, and in some ways unmatched by the agrarian communities beginning to populate the fertile river valleys. These communities, newly settled and unfamiliar with the long cycles of the sky, would have seen the builders as something otherworldly. Not gods, but people with knowledge so profound it might as well have been divine. As generations passed, the builders' population dwindled, their traditions fractured, their language faded, leaving only substrate words in the tongues of emerging cultures. Their cosmology, once a living system, became symbolic stories told by those who no longer understood their meaning. Their architectural mastery, once precise and intentional, became imitated imperfectly by people who saw only form, not function. This scenario explains much of the archaeological record. Advanced early phases followed by regression, symbolic motifs repeated without meaning, architectural traditions preserved but misaligned, myths referencing beings lost to time. A small, skilled population fading within a larger, expanding humanity. But one question remains. Why did they fade? Why does no site show signs of a prolonged cultural presence? Why are their graves absent? Why does their genetic identity fail to appear clearly in ancient remains? This question goes to the heart of the mystery, and to approach it, you must consider the possibility of a cultural rather than biological identity. A lineage of knowledge rather than blood. A tradition carried by groups who may have intermarried with local populations, leaving behind no distinct genetic signature. A tradition that could survive only as long as specific practices, rituals, and teachings were preserved. And that would disappear once environmental or societal disruptions severed the chain of transmission. In this view, the pre-Sumerian builders were not a separate race in any biological sense, but a cultural lineage descending from Ice Age survivors who carried a memory of the world before the flood. Their fading was not a dramatic extinction, but a quiet dissolution. Their knowledge did not vanish. It became myth. Their architectural principles did not disappear. They became scripture. Their symbolic grammar did not end. It became religion. And yet, some anomalies remain too stubborn to fit comfortably into this interpretive frame. The missing graves, the sudden abandonment of sites without evidence of migration, the shared architectural grammar across vast distances, the recurring elongated figurines, the precision of alignments incompatible with simple cultural imitation, the sudden regression of skill after their disappearance. These anomalies leave the door open to a more radical possibility, that the pre-Sumerian builders were a people shaped by conditions different from those of later civilizations. People whose origins lie deeper in time, separated from the Neolithic world by a boundary we can no longer see clearly. A people whose appearance in the archaeological record is sudden because their story begins elsewhere. A people whose disappearance is mysterious because their home, their original landscapes, and their ancestral settlements may now lie beneath oceans or deserts reshaped by the violent end of the Ice Age. As you travel mentally across the ancient world, across drowned coastlines, submerged river deltas, vanished lakes, and shifting plains, you can almost sense their presence on the edges of vision. A people who lived in a world erased by rising seas. A people who migrated inland in small numbers. A people who carried knowledge that seemed supernatural to those who came after. A people who left behind only the faintest of traces. Yet these faint traces twist together into a single thread, a thread that points toward a vanished chapter in human history. A chapter written not in clay, but in ratios and alignments, in substrate words and symbolic motifs, in foundations that predate the cultures built atop them. A chapter waiting in silence for someone patient enough to pull the thread and listen. Tonight, as the landscapes of ancient Mesopotamia shift behind your closed eyes, you sense that you are approaching the heart of the mystery. The artifacts no longer feel like relics. The myths no longer feel like metaphors. The vanished builders no longer feel like abstractions. They feel like a presence just beyond reach, ancient, deliberate, and still watching from the deepest layers of our forgotten past. And with that presence comes a quiet question. What happened to the world they came from? And how much of it survives in the foundations beneath our feet? To follow this presence further, this faint shadow of a people whose memory flickers beneath the first civilizations, you must step into the realm where archaeology, geology, and human myth blend into something neither discipline can fully claim. This is where the deepest questions emerge, not from what was built, nor from what was recorded, but from what was lost. For every structure left behind by the pre-Sumerian builders, there are dozens more that may never be found, erased by rivers shifting their beds, by coastlines sinking, by deserts swallowing entire worlds. And it is within these erased landscapes that the truth of their origin likely lies. Consider for a moment the world around 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. Sea levels were more than 100 meters lower. Entire continents had different shapes. Vast coastal plains, some larger than modern nations, stretched where only ocean lies today. River networks ran across exposed shelves, now hidden beneath the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, and the Arabian Sea. These drowned landscapes were fertile, temperate, and abundant. perfect environments for early settlements that would never survive the post-glacial floods that followed. If the pre-Sumerian builders descended from Ice Age peoples who lived in these now submerged regions, then their sudden appearance in the archaeological record is not mysterious at all. The mystery lies beneath the waves. Geologists have shown that the flooding of the Persian Gulf Basin, once a vast river valley fed by the Tigris, Euphrates, and Karun, occurred rapidly between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago. This timeline overlaps with the earliest hints of complex settlement in northern Mesopotamia. If a culture had once flourished along the exposed floor of that ancient valley, then its displacement inland would have been sudden and traumatic. Its people may have scattered in small, disconnected groups, carrying fragments of their traditions into unfamiliar land. Their architecture would shift, their materials would change, their rituals would adapt, but certain core ideas, cosmic alignments, sacred ratios, symbolic motifs, would remain intact for a time. This model aligns with the archaeological evidence, advanced traditions appearing abruptly, fading unevenly, and leaving behind a substrate of knowledge absorbed by early Mesopotamian societies. Small groups of displaced survivors could have seeded these traditions across wide regions, but such groups would also be vulnerable. Their population may have been too small to sustain their original identity, their knowledge too fragile to survive beyond a few generations without the infrastructure of their homeland, their language too isolated to persist within expanding Neolithic populations. This vision of a displaced culture, carrying ancient memory into a reshaped world, explains many anomalies. It explains the suddenness of their appearance. It explains the rapid decline of their skills. It explains the absence of graves, if their burial traditions lay in landscapes long submerged. It explains the mythic memories preserved by later civilizations. Memories of sages from before the flood, bearers of knowledge from a time when the foundations of the earth were not yet set. Yet, as compelling as this model is, certain details still resist resolution. Some artifacts seem too advanced, too precise, too deliberately crafted to fit comfortably within the capacities of small migrating groups. Some alignments match astronomical positions from epochs even older than the presumed Ice Age settlements. Some symbolic motifs appear on artifacts thousands of kilometers apart, separated by cultures with no known connection. These anomalies suggest a deeper coherence, as though the pre-Sumerian builders were not merely displaced survivors, but the last echoes of a much older tradition, one that perhaps spanned continents before the world as we know it took shape. To explore this deeper possibility, imagine the Earth not as a series of isolated regions, but as a connected world during the climatic calm before the final meltwater pulses. Coastlines stretched outward, dotted with settlements whose architectural logic reflected shared values and cosmologies. People moved along rivers, across plains, from shore to shore, guided by a worldview that saw the sky as a map and the earth as a reflection of cosmic order. These people might not have been numerous. They might not have built monuments like later civilizations, but their architectural language, symbolic vocabulary, and cosmological principles may have formed the substrate upon which later cultures unconsciously built. If this tradition spanned the late Pleistocene world, then the scattered evidence we see today, early stone circles, symbolic figurines, mysterious alignments, could be the final sparks of a once coherent cultural constellation extinguished by rising seas. The settlements found in pre-Sumerian layers may then be only the inland refuges, the quiet aftermath of a world collapsing under the force of climate. This may also explain the disappearance of the elongated figurine tradition, a style that spans vast distances but fades abruptly as the Holocene progresses. These figures may represent ancestors, teachers, or symbolic ideals originating from a population that once inhabited a shared coastal world. Their disappearance could reflect the final dissolution of that population into the expanding tide of Neolithic humanity. A cultural signature erased beneath the waves, and yet, even if their homeland lies lost beneath the ocean, their influence persists in a place that does not erode. Story. Story remembers what stone forgets. Myths preserve shapes long after the people who lived them have vanished. And among the earliest myths of Mesopotamia, you find a recurring pattern. Beings described as those who built before, those who measured the sky, those who walked the land when it was young. These beings are associated with wisdom, architecture, agriculture, and cosmology. They bring order where there was chaos. They retreat when their work is done. They leave behind instructions, templates, sacred measures. In some stories, they return to the waters. In others, they ascend to the stars. Always they vanish. Always their departure marks the start of human civilization. To the modern mind, these myths appear metaphorical, but metaphor arises from experience. And what experience would generate a myth of disappearing builders who brought knowledge from a world destroyed by water? What memory lies beneath the legends of sages who lived before the flood? Archaeology cannot answer this directly. Its tools are designed to excavate what has survived, not what has been erased. But mythology, geology, linguistics, and architecture together create a wider lens through which to view the earliest chapters of the human story. And when viewed through that lens, the pre-Sumerian builders begin to resemble not an anomaly, but the final inheritors of something older and deeper. Yet there remains a question even more haunting than their origin. What was the anchor of their world? What principle guided their cosmology so consistently that traces of it survive thousands of years after their disappearance? What central idea shaped their architecture, their symbols, their orientation to the sky? This is where the anchor concept reveals itself, a single thread woven through every fragment of the pre-Sumerian legacy. The belief that the earth and sky were reflections of one another, two halves of a single cosmic order. Their architecture mirrors celestial cycles. Their symbols echo star patterns. Their settlements align with solstices. Even their figurines, with their elongated forms, suggest beings who looked not inward but upward, toward a sky that held the memory of their world. This cosmological principle, the idea that the world above shapes the world below, became the foundation of Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian thought. It appears in ziggurat design, in sacred geometry, in temple ritual, but its earliest expression, faint and fragmented, lies in the architecture and artifacts of the pre-Sumerian builders. If this principle was the anchor of their identity, then their disappearance becomes even more poignant. For a people who believed the earth reflected the sky, a world changed by rising seas, shifting climates, and vanishing coastlines would have felt like a cosmic rupture, a severing of the harmony that structured their existence. Their traditions may have fractured not only due to migration or population decline, but because their cosmos itself had changed. The sky remained, but the earth no longer aligned with it. This rupture may explain the final dissolution of their culture. Their worldview could not survive the loss of the landscapes that anchored it. Their sacred geometries became misaligned. Their cosmology became memory. Their knowledge became echo. And so they faded. Not suddenly, not violently, but quietly, gradually, until they were no longer a people, only a presence woven through the foundations of the civilizations that followed. Tonight, as you follow the fading trace of their cosmology across time, you may sense that their story is not merely a lost chapter of human history, but a reflection of something universal. How knowledge survives long after identity has vanished, how memory persists even when its origins are forgotten, how the sky watches over the rise and fall of worlds. In the next step of this journey, the ground beneath our feet will begin to shift. The faint outline of the pre-Sumerian builders, once elusive, will sharpen as we approach the threshold between a forgotten past and the cataclysm that erased it. The flood is coming. Not only the literal deluge that shaped early myth, but a deeper flood of geological and cosmic events that may hold the key to understanding why these ancient architects vanished from the story of humankind. And somewhere in that approaching tide, the silent builders wait, still watching, still present, their forgotten world rising through the cracks of our own.